Hey guys, welcome back to the channel Historical Tales for Sleep. Close your eyes. See yourself in muddy fields, burdened by taxes or tradition, your body starved and your spirit tied to land you didn't own. This is not fantasy, it is the daily survival of samurai farmers and European serfs alike. Their suffering shaped history. This narrative intertwines the struggles of Japanese peasant farmers and European serfs. Using trusted, accessible sources, it captures the hardships they endured under feudal systems, while highlighting the historical contexts that shaped their lives. Bound by feudal birthright in feudal Japan, samurai farmers, though peasant-born, often held land, yet shouldered crippling rice taxes, sometimes up to half their harvest, sustaining daimyo authority. In feudal Europe, serfs were legally tied to the manor, requiring permission to travel, marry, or even sell livestock. Both groups had virtually no autonomy, entrapped by birth and burden. Economics of feudal Japan. In feudal Japan between 1185 CE and 1868 CE, citation needed, vassals offered their loyalty and services, military or other, to a landlord in exchange for access to a portion of land and its harvest. In such a system, political power is diverted from a central monarch, and control is divided up amongst wealthy landowners and warlords. The initial widespread practice of feudalism in Japan coincided with the instatement of the first shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo, who acted as the de facto ruler of Japan over the Japanese emperor. At the same time, the warrior class, samurai, gained political power that previously belonged to the aristocratic nobility, kugosh. The shogunates distributed estates, shun, to loyal subjects, the most powerful of whom became daimyo, or governors of vast land masses who often had private armies. Unlike in medieval European feudalism, the supervisors of the land, known as gitos, stewards, and shugos, constables, did not initially own the land themselves, which remained under the shogunate's control. The daimyo used a portion of their income from taxation of peasants to pay the samurai, usually in rice. Over time, however, the most powerful Jito and Shugo daimyo began challenging the authority of the shogun, eventually leading to the collapse of the feudal system in the 19th century. Social and economic trends. Village nucleation is the process by which villages become amalgamated, creating larger and more complex settlements resembling multifunctional regional hubs. Buildings were built closer to one another, with moats and walls becoming increasingly common, appearing in Japan during the 13th century. This process was accelerated by the development of more advanced agricultural technology, including double cropping and increased fertilizer use. The coalescence of medieval villages gave way to the emergence of forts and castles, often along trade routes or rivers, which served as homes for daimyos, feudal lords, and local samurai groups. The increased size of the villages and their status as economic hubs facilitated contact with outsiders. Competition over natural resources increased as commerce grew throughout Japan. As a result, peasants, artisans, and merchants, relying on farmers for food, migrated toward these agricultural sites, creating urban centers for commerce. Peasants began speaking collectively, oftentimes engaging in disputes against their social superiors. This prompted the need for improved managerial strategy, leading to self-governing organizations. Agriculture, the economy of early feudal Japan, was based almost entirely on agriculture, with rice as the basis of trade. The landowners capable of producing the most rice quickly gained political and social authority to gain the status of daimyo. One bu to produce 10,000 koku of rice, or an equivalent form of produce, The koku is a Japanese unit of measurement equal to about 180 liters, or 5 bushels. The power of feudal lords was often directly quantified by their output in koku rather than acreage of land ownership or military might. In fact, the amount of military service required from a vassal depended on the koku of their specific fief. Generally, a 1,000 koku fief equated to 1 mounted warrior, 2 musketmen, 1 archer, and 5 pikemen. A measurement of potential income, kokudaka, was used to rank each estate and determine the order in which they would be evaluated by the shogunal court. Stability of the Edo period. The Edo period, 1603 to 1868, also known as the Tokugawa period, began when Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun. This era is marked by urbanization, an increase in domestic commerce, and a decrease in foreign commerce toward the mid-1600s. Transportation of produce from more distant rural areas to new towns became increasingly sought after. This resulted in a system of material transport and warehousing in Kyoto. Soon, Kyoto became home to a central rice market and set prices through an auction system. The shogun held national authority while the daimyo firmly controlled the various regions across the archipelago. During this time, a clear hierarchy emerged, atop which sat the emperor, who in reality was a figurehead, followed by the shogun, daimyo, samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. Merchants were seen as the lowest class because they produced nothing of their own, instead profiting from the production of others. However, with the rise of construction, trades, and banking facilities, merchant associations and rice brokers prospered. These merchants coalesced their shops around Dushma, where the rice exchange was established in 1697, and where the world's first futures market would come to exist, to sell rice that was not yet harvested. Though initially against futures trading, the shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune officially authorized the use of futures contracts in 1730 after the price of rice fell sharply, threatening the samurai's income. The declining economic position of the warrior class relative to the merchant class caused anxiety amongst the ruling parties who wished to maintain their dominance, leading to decreased regulation on trading policies. The Edo period ended as Japan opened its borders to Western commerce. Nanban trade was a period of international trade that began in the Sengoku period around 1543 through contact between Japanese and Portuguese explorers and merchants. Quickly, global trade routes were established, which exposed Japan to refined sugar, firearms, new shipbuilding techniques, and Christianity. Embargoes against Japan from China, following naval clashes between the two empires, had limited the supply of Chinese goods in Japan. Portugal viewed this as a profitable opportunity to act as an intermediary, since there was a high demand for Chinese goods in Japan, notably for silk yarn, which was highly sought-after commodity by the warrior classes. Similarly, the Chinese placed the high value of Japanese silver, creating a commerce market that the Portuguese were able to navigate with financial success. The civil war in Japan during the late 16th century also benefited Portuguese merchants, as daimyos competed with each other to offer more attractive trading conditions in their farms. In the late 16th and early 17th century, Japanese red seal ships as well as vessels from Spain, Holland, and England competed with Portuguese merchants, but Portugal still maintained a firm grasp on East Asian trade due to their prior negotiations and relationships with Chinese merchants. The period of Nanban trade declined in the early Edo period as the Tokugawa shogunate worried about the spread of Christianity in Japan. Koinage until the mid-13th century, rice and sometimes silk and other types of cloth were primarily used as the medium of exchange in medieval Japan. As a result of trade expansion beginning in the 12th century, Chinese and other foreign-made coins were gaining popularity and were adopted as the preferred currency. In the late 15th century, copper coins began being distinguished by their quality, with merchants only accepting high-quality coins and rejecting coins of lower quality through a process known as schroffing, or selecting coins. This process expanded as commodity trade grew and coins' demand began to exceed their supply. Schroffing created a divide in the value of coinage held by higher social classes, who had better access to high-quality coins, and lower classes, prompting anti-schroffing decrees from Japanese authorities. Chinese coins entered the Japanese market through a variety of ways and created a circulation system with no state intervention. The copper coins, which were originally denounced as a viable form of currency by the imperial court in Japan, gained value through their issuance by the Chinese court. More important to the coin's value and credibility, however, were market forces in Japan, which determined prices before the state did. 15 harsh realities of serfdom in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, society was structured around a rigid hierarchy, with serfs at the bottom. These peasants were bound to the land they worked, providing essential agricultural labor that sustained the feudal system. In exchange for their toil, serfs received protection and the right to cultivate plots for their own subsistence. However, their lives were marked by numerous hardships, including limited personal freedoms and heavy obligations to their lords. 1. Bound to the land, serfs were legally tied to the estate where they were born and could not leave without the lord's consent, trapping generations in poverty. Unlike slaves, serfs could not be bought or sold individually. Instead, they were bound to the land they worked. This hereditary subordination meant that serfs' children inherited their status, perpetuating a cycle of dependence and limited mobility. 2. Heavy labor with little reward. Serfs were subjected to grueling agricultural labor, with the majority of their harvests allocated to their lords. Despite their relentless work, they often subsisted at minimal levels. They lived a subsistent existence, barely scraping by during the most meager months. Serfs were also vulnerable to poor harvests, as they still had to pay their dues to the landowners. 3. Onerous taxes and dues. Serfs were burdened with various taxes and dues, including tithes to the church, which amounted to 10% of their produce. Additionally, they were required to pay fees in the form of agricultural produce, such as wheat, and sometimes even chickens or geese, depending on the lord's demands. These obligations significantly reduced their ability to support their own families, perpetuating a cycle of poverty. 4. Restricted rights and autonomous. Serfs lacked legal and personal freedoms, needing permission from their lord to marry or travel. Their limited autonomy stifled social mobility. The only time a serf would leave their holding would be at the lord's whim if mobilized for battle. This was the one time a serf could potentially improve their standing, but it was at risk to their own life. For more information, see World History Encyclopedia. Serf. 5. Subject to lord's justice. Serfs were subject to the lord's justice, often without fairness or impartiality. The manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward, handled disputes and offences within the manor. These courts had limited jurisdiction and were primarily concerned with enforcing the lord's rights and customs. Serfs had little recourse against mistreatment, as the lord's decisions were final. 6. Vulnerable to famine and disease. Serfs were highly susceptible to famine and disease due to their limited resources and dependence on subsistence farming. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, caused by severe weather conditions, led to widespread crop failures and a significant loss of life. Additionally, the Black Death of 1347 to 1352 further devastated the serf population, with mortality rates varying across regions. These calamities underscored the precariousness of serfdom, as entire villages could be decimated by hunger and illness. 7. Grueling working hours. Serfs' workdays varied seasonally, with longer hours during peak agricultural periods. In summer, a day could last up to 16 hours, while in winter it was about 8 hours. Despite these long hours, work was often intermittent, with breaks for meals and rest. Additionally, the Catholic Church mandated numerous holidays, providing serfs with significant time off throughout the year. 8. Limited access to education. Most serfs were illiterate. Education was reserved for the elite, making it nearly impossible to improve their social status. Formal education was primarily accessible to the clergy and nobility, with the majority of the population lacking literacy skills. This educational divide reinforced the rigid social hierarchy of medieval Europe. 9. Forced military service. In times of war, lords could compel serfs to join their armies, often with poor equipment and little training. This obligation was part of the feudal system, where military service was a duty owed by vassals to their lords. Serfs, being at the bottom of the feudal hierarchy, were often called upon to serve as infantry or support personnel, lacking the resources and training of the nobility. 10. No inheritance of property. Serfs were unable to own land, and upon their death, their possessions were often claimed by the lord, denying families the chance to build wealth. This lack of property rights reinforced the hereditary nature of serfdom, as children inherited their parents' servile status, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and dependence. 11. Constant fear of arbitrary demands. Lords could change labor or tax requirements unpredictably, leaving serfs in a state of uncertainty and anxiety. This unpredictability often led to unrest and uprisings, as serfs sought to challenge the arbitrary demands imposed upon them. However, failed rebellions could prove deadly for the perpetrators. For a detailed explanation, refer to the article on manorialism by Britannica. 12. Harsh living conditions. Serfs lived in cramped, damp, and unsanitary conditions. Their homes were often single-room cottages made from mud and timber, with thatched roofs and no glass windows, leaving them vulnerable to the elements. These dwellings lacked proper sanitation facilities, contributing to the spread of diseases and exposure in winter. 13. Limited legal protection. Serfs had minimal legal rights, with laws rarely favoring them. Punishments for minor infractions could be severe, and they had little recourse against mistreatment. This lack of protection perpetuated exploitation. They were totally vulnerable to the whims of their lords and had very little recourse. For more information, see National Archives, Medieval Law. 14. Social stigma and discrimination. Serfs were looked down upon by higher classes, facing prejudice and exclusion from religious, cultural, and social life. This marginalization reinforced their subordinate status within the feudal hierarchy. It was almost impossible for a serf to climb the social ladder and improve their position. For a more detailed discussion, refer to the article on serf in the Oxford Reference. 15. Few routes to freedom. Manumission was rare and costly. Escaping bondage was dangerous, with little guarantee of a better life. Only a minority found escape through wealth, city migration, or rare opportunities. This was in the pre-industrial period. so there was very little chance for a peasant to change their social status. For more details, see Thought Co, Serfdom and Peasantry, daily labours that crushed the body. Farmers in both realms worked dawn to dusk with primitive tools, with wielding hoes in rice paddies or old wooden ploughs in European fields. Infectious, poverty, bred disease, cramped, unsanitary homes increased risk. Their toil demanded every ounce of strength, often yielding little of worth. Samurai groups and farming villages. The Japanese feudal system began to take shape under the Kamakura Bakufu. Though it remained only inchoate during the Kamakura period, warrior landlords lived in farming villages and supervised peasant labor, or themselves carried on agriculture, while the central civil aristocracy and the temples and shrines held huge public lands, kokugario, and private estates in various provinces and wielded power comparable to that of the Baku. These shuen were managed by influential resident landlords who had become warriors. They were often the original developers of their districts, who became officials of the provincial government and agents of the shuen. Under the Kamakura Bakufu, many such individuals became gokunin and were appointed jitu in lands where the Bakufu were allowed access. As leaders of a large number of villages, these jitu labored to develop the rice fields and irrigation works in the areas under their jurisdiction, and they and other influential landlords constructed spacious homes for themselves in the villages and hamlets where they lived. Among these landlords, some were vassals of the shogun, while others were connected to the aristocracy or the temples and shrines. The jitu owed their loyalty to the shogun, for whom they performed public services such as guard duty in Kyoto and Kamakura. In return, the shogun not only guaranteed these men's security of tenure in their traditional land holdings, but rewarded them with new holdings in confiscated lands such as from the Taira or the supporters of Gotoba. This connection between lord and vassal, on which grants of land ownership or management were based, gave Japanese society a somewhat feudal character, but these lands were by no means complete fiefs. The Kamakura Bakufu did not possess large tracts of its own land that it could grant to its vassals as fiefs in return for service. Kamakura warriors could control traditional land types, shuen and kokugario, or be newly appointed into confiscated lands. In either case, there was a nominal absentee central proprietor temple, shrine, or aristocratic or royal family who maintained substantial control over the land. Thus, there was a limit on the degree to which the Kamakura warrior could exploit the land and people under his control. Conflict was endemic between central proprietor, usually a local representative of the proprietor, and jitu. The former wished to maintain as much control and income as possible, while the latter was concerned with expanding his share. Since the jitu was entirely under the control of Kamakura, disputes flooded the warrior headquarters from landowners seeking to curtail jitu encroachments. Thus, the primary focus of Kamakura activity became the dispensing of justice in legal cases involving land disputes. The Kamakura Bakufu gained a reputation for fairness, issuing countless orders of admonition to its vassals to follow the precedents on the land in question. By various means, however, Kamakura warriors managed to whittle away significantly the absentee control of shuen proprietors. Conflict also was endemic between the farming population and the warriors, stemming from the efforts of the former to increase personal and economic autonomy, as well as to enlarge their holdings within the shuen or kokugario. There were several different statuses among the peasantry, including myoshu, prominent farmers with taxable named fields, myodin of significant size and long standing, small cultivators with precarious and shifting tenures, and others who paid only labor services to the proprietor or jittu. These groups, while distinct from one another, were also quite separate from transient agriculturalists present in many estates. The lowest peasant category, called genin, low person, was made up of people who were essentially household servants with no land rights. The samurai, in theory, performed military service on the battlefield and during times of peace, in addition to managing agricultural holdings, engaging in hunting and training in the martial arts, and nourishing a rugged and practical character. Medieval texts speak of Kiaba no Michi, the way of the bow and horse, or Yumiya Toru Mino Narai, the practices of those who used the bow and arrow, indicating that there was an emerging sense of ideal warrior behavior that grew out of this daily training and the experience of actual warfare. Pride of family name was especially valued, and loyal service to one's overlord became the fundamental ethic. This was the origin of the more highly developed sense of a warrior code of later ages. Like his Heian predecessor, the Kamakura warrior was a mounted knight whose primary martial skill was equestrian archery. The status of women in warrior families was comparatively high. Like their Heian predecessors, they were allowed to inherit a portion of the estates and even jittu posts, a practice that gradually came to be restricted. After the middle of the Kamakura period, the farming villages in which the warriors resided underwent changes as agricultural practices advanced. Other aspects of society were changing as well. Artisans were frequently attached to the proprietors of the shuen and progressively became more specialized, responding to a specific growth of consumer demand. Centers for metal casting and metalworking, paper manufacture, and other skills appeared outside the capital, in various provincial localities. For the first time, the exchange of agricultural products, manufactured goods, and other products thrived. Local markets, held on 3 fixed days a month, became common. Copper coins from Sung China circulated in these markets, while itinerant merchants increased their activity. Bills of exchange were also used for payments to distant localities. In the large ports along the inland sea and Lake Biwa, specialized wholesale merchants Toimaru appeared who, as contractors, stored, transported, and sold goods. Further, it became common for many merchants and artisans to form guilds, known as za'a, organized under the temples, shrines, or civil aristocrats, from whom they gained special monopoly privileges and exemptions from customs duties. Kamakura culture, the new Buddhism and its influence during the Kamakura period. The newly arisen samurai class began to supersede the ancient civil aristocracy, which nonetheless continued to maintain the classical culture. Vigorous overseas trade expanded contacts with the continent, fostering the introduction of Zen Buddhism in Chinese, Shen and Neo-Confucianism from Sung China. Chinese influences could be seen in monochrome painting style, Subokuga, architecture, certain skills in pottery manufacture, and the custom of tea drinking, all of which contributed to the formation of early medieval culture and exerted an enormous influence on everyday life in Japan in matters of religion. The great social changes that took place between the end of the Heian period and the early Kamakura period fostered a sense of crisis and religious awakening and caused the people to demand a simple standard of faith in place of the complicated teachings and ceremonies of the ancient Buddhism. The warriors of the farming villages, in particular, demanded a religion that would suit their personal experience. Several new Buddhist sects sprang up that eschewed difficult ascetic practices and recondite scholarship. Among these may be included the Jodo, or Pure Land, sect mentioned earlier, and its offshoot, the Shin True School, which sought reliance on the saving grace of Amida, and the sect established by the former Tendai priest, Nichi, which sought salvation in the Lotus Sutra. By contrast, the Zen school sought to open the way to insight by self-effort Jiriki. Hence, it met with a ready response, satisfying the demands of many samurai. At the same time, scholarship and the arts were still deeply linked with the Tendai and Shingon sects of esoteric Buddhism, which was a vigorous influence even in Shinto circles. Nonetheless, the new forms of worship expanded popular participation in Buddhism tremendously in scholarly and literary circles. The Kyoto nobility confined themselves largely to the annotation and interpretation of the ancient classics and to the study of precedents and ceremonies. But at the beginning of the Kamakura period, a brilliant circle of waka poets around the retired Emperor Gotaba produced a new imperial selection of poems entitled the Shin-Kokin Wakash. The waka of this period is characterized by the term yeijin, which may be described as a mood both profound and mysterious. Just before the Jeikyū disturbance, the Tendai monk Jian, a member of the Fujiwara family, completed his Gukonsho, Jottings of a Fool. This is the first work of historical philosophy in Japan to incorporate a notion of historical causality, and it provides an interpretive picture of the rise and fall of political powers from a Buddhist viewpoint. Meanwhile, as warriors began to contend and mingle with court nobles, many warrior leaders developed a love of scholarship and a delight in waka poetry. One was H.J. Sanetoki, who collected Japanese and Chinese books and founded a famous library, the Konozawa Bunko, in the Shomyo Temple at what is now Yokohama, reflecting the rise of the warrior class. Military epics became popular. The most famous is the anonymously written The Tale of the Hike Monogatari, the various tales of which were first recited throughout the country by Buddhist troubadours called Biwa Hoshi. After the middle Kamakura period, as Buddhist pessimism grew fainter, various kinds of instruction manuals and family injunctions were composed, while collections of essays, such as Yoshida Kenko's essays in idleness, Surazurega, also made their appearance. The new nationalistic fervor aroused by the successful struggle against the Mongols found expression in Koken Shiren's Genko Shakusho 1332, a 30-volume history of Buddhism in Japan. In the visual arts, the carving of wooden images of famous monks flourished, and, after the middle of the Kamakura period, Chinese styles of the Sung dynasty also influenced Kamakura wood carving. In painting as well as sculpture, Buddhist themes began to give way to more secular works. Especially popular were picture scrolls, emakimono, which took as their themes the history of temples and shrines, the biographies of founders of religious sects, and, increasingly, military epics and the secular life of both courtiers and warriors. Decline of Kamakura society. During the troubled state of society at the end of the Kamakura period, the Gokunin faced difficult times. They had borne virtually all the expense of military service against the Mongols, but their claims for reward went largely unanswered, since no lands or other wealth were confiscated from the invaders. Thus, they were financially pressed and often in debt. At the same time, important structural changes occurred in warrior houses. First, since warriors proliferated over generations while land holdings remained constant, the practice of dividing lands among heirs gave way to single inheritance, often entirely to the eldest son. The shift from divided to single inheritance was accelerated in the post-Mongol era and became the primary means of inheritance in warrior families. Power thus became concentrated in the head of the house, to whom other family members were of necessity subordinated. Second, deputies sent out by the heads of eastern warrior families to oversee their distant landholdings often broke with the main family, They formed strong ties with other local warrior houses, perhaps even becoming vassals of a shogun. Minimally, their ties to the Kamakura regime weakened. General economic conditions began to undermine the position of the Bakufu vassals. Yet, despite the social crises among the landholders, trade was flourishing. Coins came increasingly into circulation, and the urban lifestyle began to be imitated in the provinces. But landowners were often unable to meet their expenditures from the income of their limited holdings, even if they practiced single inheritance. Therefore, they borrowed money at high rates of interest from rich moneylenders, and many were forced to surrender their holdings when unable to repay their loans. The Bakufu responded with debt cancellation edicts, which gave temporary relief but neglected the long-term problem. Consequently, the gap between rich and poor became marked among the Bakufu. In particular, some shugo, who had the right to raise troops, attempted to turn resident landlords into their vassals. Thus, the vassalage structure of the Kamakura regime began to unravel, and powerful local magnates, nominally Kamakura vassals, began to challenge the authority of the HJ regents. In the Bakufu, the Ashikaga, Sasaki, Shiny, and Shimazu families were among the most powerful among these. Buffeted by economic changes beyond its control, the Bakufu began to totter. Shaken also by the disputes between the HJ family and the rival Shugo, the Adaki family was forced into revolt and defeated by the HJ in Ichen Laonbai Bashawu, along with other warrior houses accused of plotting with them. Subsequently, the main HJ house turned increasingly inward and autocratic, further alienating other vassal houses when the Ando family raised a revolt in Mutsu province at the end of the Kamakura period. The Bakufu found it difficult to suppress, partly because of the remoteness of the site of the uprising. In addition, regional unions of small landlords developed in the Kinai, the 5 home provinces centered around Kyoto. Elsewhere as well, local warriors with grievances increasingly took the law into their own hands, seizing crops or otherwise disturbing local order. Termed a kutu by the authorities, they included many different elements: frustrated local warriors, pirates, aggrieved peasants, and ordinary robbers. Cultivators as well took advantage of unsettled times to rise up against jitu or shuen proprietors. These accumulating weaknesses of the Bakufu prompted a movement among the Kyoto nobility to regain political power from the military. The occasion was provided by the question of the imperial succession. In the mid-13th century, 2 competing lines for the succession emerged. The senior line centered on the Jimyu Temple in Kyoto, and the junior line centered on the Daikoku Temple on the western edge of the city. In the last half of the century, each side sought to win the support of the Bakufu. In 1317, Kamakura proposed a compromise that would allow the 2 lines to alternate the succession. But the dispute did not cease. Finally, in 1318, Prince Takaharu of the junior line acceded to the throne as the Emperor Godeigo. The Mura or Ashikaga period 1338 to 1573, the Kemu restoration and the dual dynasties, and the accession of Godeigo. The retired Emperor Go-Yuda broke the long-established custom and dissolved the office of retired emperor in no-ch. As a result, the entire authority of the imperial government was concentrated in the hands of a single emperor, Godeigo. A party of young, reforming court nobles gathered around the emperor, who strove to renovate the government, but to realize his ideal of a true imperial restoration, it was necessary for Godeigo to rid himself of the interference of the Bakufu. His plans for its overthrow were discovered, however, and he was arrested and exiled to Oki Island. But in the Kinai area, local leaders, supported by militant Buddhist monks, raised an army to overthrow the Bakufu. The imperial forces were led by Prince Morinaga or Moriyoshi and Kusunoki Masashi, but the decisive victory was brought about by the two powerful Kanto warrior families of Ashikaga Takeuji and Nitta Yoshisada, discontented vassals of the HJ family. In 1333, Takeuji turned on the HJ and attacked the HJ headquarters in Kyoto. Yoshisada meanwhile destroyed the Bakufu in Kamakura, at which time most of the HJ leaders perished in battle or by their own hand. Thus, after 140 years' rule, the Bakufu government was brought to an end. The return of Go-Daigo to Kyoto in 1333 is known as the Kemyu Restoration. The emperor immediately set about to restore direct imperial rule. He abolished the powerful office of Kampaku and set up a central bureaucracy. He revived the records office, Kirakusho, to settle lawsuits in the provinces, and established the courts of miscellaneous claims Zasho Ketsudansho to handle minor suits, and a guard station, Mushudakoro, to keep order among the warriors in Kyoto. He placed Morinaga in charge of his military forces and set up members of the imperial family as provincial leaders in the north and east. Many local warriors, however, who had joined the imperial forces in the overthrow of the Bakufu were disappointed in the division of the spoils and the direction of the emperor's reforms. Ashikaga Takeuji now turned against Go-Daigo, raising a revolt that in 1336 drove the emperor from Kyoto. Takeuji enthroned an emperor from the senior imperial line, while Go-Daigo and his followers set up a rival court in the Yoshino Mountains near Nara. For the next 60 years, political power was divided between the southern court in Yoshino, the northern court in Kyoto. It remained for Takeuji's grandson Yoshimitsu to establish peace 1392 between the two courts. Thereafter, imperial succession remained with the descendants of the northern court. Throughout the long dispute, however, local warriors attached themselves to Shugo, who increasingly asserted their independence from central authority. The establishment of the Muromachi Bakufuafta, the withdrawal of Go-Daigo to Yoshino, Ashikaga Takeuji set up a Bakufu at Niyu Takakura in Kyoto. But in 1378, Takeuji's grandson, the shogun Yoshimitsu, moved the Bakufu to the Muromachi district in Kyoto, where it remained and took final shape. Yoshimitsu, assisted by the successive shogunal deputies Konrei Hosokawa, Yoriyuki and Shiba Yoshi, gradually overcame the power of the great military governors, Shugo, who had been so important in the founding of the new regime. He destroyed the Yamana family in 1391, and, in uniting the northern and southern courts, attacked and destroyed the great Shugo Yuchi Yoshihiro, thus gaining control of the inland sea. Yoshimitsu was now raised to the highest office of Prime Minister, or Doge-Dejin. He constructed the famed Golden Pavilion, Kinkaku. See below the establishment of warrior culture northeast of the capital in Kitayama, taking great pride in its luxurious display, and also re-established trade and diplomacy with Ming Dynasty China under the title King of Japan. Government structure. The Muromachi Bakufu inherited almost unchanged the structure of its Kamakura predecessor above the establishment of warrior government, setting up a Mandakoro, Moncherio, and Samari. But after the appointment of Hosokawa Yoriyuki as Kanrei, this post became the most important in the Bakufu government. The official business of the Mandakoro was to control the finances of the Bakufu, and later the Ai's family, who were hereditary retainers of the Ashikaga, came to inherit this office. The Samurai Dokoro, besides handling legal judgments, was entrusted with the control of the capital. leading officials called shoji, who held the additional post of shugo of Yamashiro province, now in Kyoto urban prefecture, were next in importance to the kanrei. New offices were established to streamline judicial decisions and handle financial matters. And the Ashikaga maintained their own private guard, the HKSH. In local administration, a special administrator was set up in Kamakura to control the 10 provinces of the Kanto area. This office came to be held by heads of the Ashikaga Motoji family. The 11 provinces of Kyushu were placed under control of an office known as the Kushu Tandai. The crucial difference between the two bakufu, however, was the difference in the role of the shugo, appointed first by Takeuji in the chaos of the war between the courts. Many rose to positions of great power in one or several provinces under their purview. By Yoshimitsu's time, their number had been reduced and their powers somewhat curtailed. But the structure of the bakufu was essentially a delicate balance between the Ashikaga shogunal house and about a dozen major shugo houses, almost evenly divided between collateral Ashikaga houses and non-related warrior families. Yoshimitsu made them all establish primary residence in Kyoto, where they ruled in council with the shogun. This retarded their abilities to develop stronger vassalage ties with local warriors in their provinces, and they often sent out deputies to manage their provincial areas in their absence. Consequently, in later years, many powerful shugo from the early and middle parts of the Muromachi period were overthrown by their own deputies. The finances of the Muromachi bakufu could not be met simply from its receipts from the lands under its direct control, as Kamakura had managed to do. So, according to bakufu needs, the shugo and jitto of each province were ordered to levy monetary taxes on either every unit of land or every household. This, however, also was not fully effective in meeting financial needs. As a result, the bakufu extracted taxes from such dealers as pawnbrokers and sake brewers, who were among the wealthiest merchants of the time. Financial deficiencies also were supplemented by trading with China. Despite this more diversified tax structure, the Muromachi regime maintained only a shaky hold on the nation. The foundations of the bakufu began to be shaken by the increasing power of the shugo and by the frequent uprisings of local samurai and farmers. In the Kamakura period, the authority of the shugo was essentially limited to security matters, suppressing rebellion, apprehending murderers, and mustering out vassals for service in Kyoto. In the latter half of the northern and southern courts period, their executive power over the areas under their control was increased. As the number of disturbances grew, they gained wide powers of military command. Sometimes estates were made depots for military supplies on the pretext of protecting them from the depredations of local warriors, and half their yearly taxes were given to the This was called the equal tax division, or hanzei. Many shugo succeeded to their domains by inheritance, and in cases such as that of the Yamana family, a single shugo sometimes held a number of provinces. If the primary agent of the Kamakura bakufu had been the jitto, the shugo was the defining office of the Muromachi regime. From the outset, the controlling power of the Ashikaga bakufu was relatively weak, and, especially after the death of Yoshimitsu, the tendency for powerful shugo to defect became marked. Hence, as time passed, the office of shogun became increasingly impotent. The growth of local autonomy in the villages around Kyoto. The status of farmers rose markedly as agriculture became more highly developed, and commerce and small-scale manufacturing prospered. Also, confederations of the middle and small landlords, or mushu, proceeded apace and often led to uprisings against absentee control. Such confederations appeared where farming by the larger mushu had dissolved and middle and small Mushu had established themselves on a wide scale. These smaller landlords endeavored to defend themselves against the ravages of local warfare, forming unions to manage the forests in common and to maintain irrigation works. In such confederations, a leader called the Elder Otona would be selected to head village government. Assemblies were held regularly among its members at the village shrine or temple, and regulations were drawn up for the maintenance of community life. As self-government became strong in the communities, the resistance of farmers became fierce after the unification of the northern and southern courts. Armed uprisings broke out among the farming villages, the peasants demanding reductions in yearly taxes from the old proprietors and a moratorium on debts owed to the moneylenders. A large-scale uprising of this kind took place in 1428, in the last years of Yoshimitsu's rule. In 1429, an uprising broke out in Harima province, now part of modern Hyogo prefecture, aimed at the expulsion of the warriors from the province. In 1441, farmers living around Kyoto attacked the pawnbrokers and demanded that the Bakufu declare a moratorium on debts. Thereafter, uprisings occurred on a greater or lesser scale almost yearly, testimony to the fading power of both the Xuan system and the Bakufu. Trade between China and Japan trade. With Ming dynasty, China began after the Bakufu agreed to suppress Japanese piracy. Ashikaga Takauji had sent ships of the Tenri Temple to trade with the Yuan Mongol dynasty, but trade then ceased because of the internal disturbances, and pirates from the maritime districts of western Japan raided both China and the Korean peninsula. When Korea came under the control of the Chazanyi dynasty and in China the Ming dynasty emerged, they both requested that the Bakufu open formal trade relations, hoping to suppress piracy. Yoshimitsu, both in response to the desires of the merchants and in order to supplement Bakufu finances, began formal trade relations with Ming China and Korea, repatriating a large number of Chinese who had been taken captive by the pirates. In response, the Ming also began to trade with Japan, under the form of tribute from Yoshimitsu, King of Japan, to the Emperor of China. In order to distinguish between pirate ships and trading ships, seals received from the Ming called kangafu were used, hence the use of the term kango or tally, trade. Profits from the China trade were important to the Bakufu, but control of this trade later came into the hands of the western Shugo families of the Hosokawa and Uchi, under whose protection trading merchants became active in the ports of Hakata, Hyugo, and Sakai. After the One-in War, see below the One-in War 146777. The Uchi controlled the trade, albeit in competition and often conflict with the Hosokawa, but with the destruction of the Uchi, the Kango trade ceased, and piracy again became rife. Trade with Chazan dynasty Korea was carried on through the agency of the S family of Tsushima, and various Shugo and the merchants of Hakata were actively involved in it, importing cotton and other goods. Japanese traders even established settlements in southeastern Korea, including Pusan. Also included in the trade with China and Korea were goods imported by Japanese merchants from the Ryukyu Islands, lying between Japan and Taiwan, and dye materials, pepper, and other special products from the South Seas. Nature's cruel reminder famine and food insecurity. Europe's periodic crop failures fueled famines, famously the Great Famine 1315-17. Peasants were doomed to eat bark, wild roots. Worse, in Japan, unexpected cold snaps and overtaxation of rice created perpetual hunger, making survival tenuous even with fertile fields. Great Famine of 1315-1317. The Great Famine of 1315-1317. occasionally dated 1315 to 1322, was the first of a series of large-scale crises that struck parts of Europe early in the 14th century. Most of Europe, extending east to Poland and south to the Alps, was affected. The famine caused many deaths over an extended number of years and marked a clear end to the period of growth and prosperity from the 10th, 11th to the 13th centuries. The Great Famine started with bad weather in spring 1315. Crop failures lasted through 1316 until the summer harvest in 1317, and Europe did not fully recover until 1322. Crop failures were not the only problem. Cattle disease caused sheep and cattle numbers to fall as much as 80%. The period was marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism and infanticide. The crisis had consequences for the church, state, European society, and for future calamities to follow in the 14th century. Famines were familiar occurrences in medieval Europe. For example, localized famines occurred in the Kingdom of France during the 14th century in 1304, 1305, 1310, 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine, 1330 to 1334, 1349, 1351, 1358 to 1360, 1371, 1374 to 1375, and 1390. In the Kingdom of England, the most prosperous kingdom affected by the Great Famine, there were additional famines in 1321, 1351, and 1369. According to official records about the English royal family, an example of the best off in society for whom records were kept. The average life expectancy at birth in 1276 was 35.28 years, between 1301 and 1325. During the Great Famine, it was 29.84 years, but between 1348 and 1375, during the plague, it was only 17.33 years. The average life expectancy figures are skewed by child mortality rates, which were naturally high even during non-famine years. However, this demonstrates the steep population drop between 1348 and 1375 of about 42%. During the medieval, warm period, 10th to 13th centuries, the population of Europe exploded compared to prior eras and reached levels that were not matched again in some places until the 19th century. Indeed, parts of rural France are still less populous than in the early 14th century. The yield ratios of wheat, the number of seeds one could harvest and consume per seed planted, had been dropping since 1280, and food prices had been increasing. After favorable harvests, the ratio could be as high as 7 to 1, but after unfavorable harvests, it was as low as 2 to 1, that is, for every seed planted. 2 seeds were harvested, one for next year's seed and one for food. By comparison, modern farming has ratios of 30 to 1 or more. See agricultural productivity. The onset of the Great Famine followed the end of the medieval warm period. Between 1310 and 1330, Northern Europe saw some of the worst and most sustained periods of bad weather in the Middle Ages, characterized by severe winters and rainy and cold summers. The Great Famine may have been precipitated by a volcanic event and occurred during the Little Ice Age. Changing weather patterns, the ineffectiveness of medieval governments in dealing with crises, and population level at a historical high, made it a time with little margin for error in food production. Great Famine in the spring of 1315. Unusually heavy rain began in much of Europe. Throughout the spring and the summer, it continued to rain, and the temperature remained cool. Under such conditions, grain could not ripen, leading to widespread crop failures. Grains were brought indoors in urns and pots to keep dry. The straw and hay for the animals could not be cured, so there was no fodder for the livestock. The soil became extremely moist from the heavy rain, making it impossible to plough the fields ready for planting. In England, lowlands in Yorkshire and Nottingham were flooded, while stew ponds on the River Foss in Yorkshire were washed away. The price of food began to rise. Prices in England doubled between spring and midsummer. Salt, the only way to cure and preserve meat, was difficult to obtain because brine could not be effectively evaporated in wet weather. As a result, its price increased from 30 to 40 shillings. In Lorraine, wheat prices rose by 320%, making bread unaffordable to peasants. Stores of grain for long-term emergencies were limited to royalty, lords, nobles, wealthy merchants, and the church. Because of the general increased population pressures, even lower than average harvests meant some people would go hungry. There was little margin for failure. People began to harvest wild edible roots, grasses, nuts, and bark in the forests. A number of documented incidents show the extent of the famine. Edward II of England stopped at St. Albans on 10 August 1315 and had difficulty finding bread for himself and his entourage. It was a rare occasion in which the King of England was unable to eat. In Bristol, the city's chronicles reported that in 1315 there was a great famine of dearth, with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horseflesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear in pieces such as were newly put into prison, and devoured them half alive, half alive. The French, under Louis X, tried to invade Flanders, but in low-lying areas of the Netherlands, the fields were soaked and the army became bogged down and were forced to retreat, burning their provisions where they abandoned them, unable to carry them away. In spring 1316, it continued to rain on a European population deprived of energy and reserves to sustain itself. All segments of society, from nobles to peasants, were affected, but especially the peasants, who represented 95% of the population and who had no reserve food supplies to provide some measure of relief. The future was mortgaged by slaughtering the draft animals, eating the seed grain, abandoning children to fend for themselves. See Hansel and Gretel. And among old people, voluntary starvation, so that the younger generation could continue to work the fields. The chroniclers of the time noted many incidents of cannibalism. It was reported that during the famine, people would open the graves of the newly dead and claim them as food, though one can never tell if such talk was not simply a matter of rumor-mongering. As Lynn H. Nelson comments, the height of the famine was in 1317, as the wet weather continued. In that summer, the weather returned to normal patterns. By then, people were so weakened by diseases such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, and so much of the seed stock had been eaten, that it was not until 1325 that the food supply returned to relatively normal levels and the population began to increase. Historians debate the toll, but it is estimated that 10 to 25% of the population of many cities and towns died, though the Black Death 1347 to 1351 would kill more people. It often swept through an area in a matter of months, whereas the Great Famine lingered for years, prolonging the suffering of the populace. Jean-Pierre Leguet noted the Great Famine produced wholesale slaughter in a world that was already overcrowded, especially in the towns, which were natural outlets for rural overpopulation. Estimates of death rates vary by place, but some examples include a loss of 10 to 15% in the south of England. Northern France lost about 10% of its population. Geography and hydroclimate context. The Great Famine was restricted to northern Europe, including the British Isles, northern France, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, Germany and western Poland. It also affected some of the Baltic states, except for the far eastern Baltic, which was affected only indirectly. The famine was bounded to the south by the Alps and the Pyrenees. The 1314 to 1316 period was the fifth wettest 3-year interval in Europe from 1300 to 2012. Of the 4 wetter periods, 3 occurred after 1710, when agricultural technology was much more productive, while 1 occurred after the Black Death, when population size had already been reduced. The Great Famine's exceptional severity was due to extreme precipitation, coinciding with peak medieval population and pre-industrial agriculture, creating an extreme vulnerability to sustained adverse weather. Overlord demands corvée tides, and samurai control European serfs owed days of unpaid labor on the lord's land. Corvée, plus tides, milling fees, and even marriage taxes. Across Japan, samurai lords enforced strict land surveys and travel restrictions like Hideyoshi's class laws, consolidating state power and limiting farmers' agency. Life of a medieval peasant. What was daily life really like? Discover what life was really like for a medieval peasant. It wasn't just about hard work, it was also about daily life, family, and faith. How did they live in villages? What did they eat? What did they believe in? Learn about the feudal system, everyday struggles, homes, holidays, and the rights of the people. Step into the world of the people who were the backbone of the Middle Ages and uncover the truth behind the myths. Introduction. Who were the medieval peasants? Imagine medieval society. What comes to mind first? Knights in shining armor, powerful kings in grand castles, or monks in quiet monasteries. But the real foundation of all that splendor, and of life itself in those distant times, was something else entirely. It was the peasants, the people who worked the land with their hands, feeding the cities, armies, and noble courts. Without their daily, often unseen labor, the whole feudal system would have collapsed. But who were they? Let's take a closer look and set aside some common myths. Medieval society is often described as a pyramid or divided into 3 estates: those who fight lords and knights, those who pray the clergy, and those who work, the peasants. Peasants made up the vast majority of the population by some estimates, between 80% and 90%. Their primary role, or duty, in the feudal system was farming. They worked the land, either their own if they were free, or the lord's land if they were serfs or bound peasants, in return for the right to live on the lord's land, graze animals on shared pastures, or use the lord's mill to grind grain. Peasants had to pay. They paid in goods a portion of their crops, livestock, or handmade items, and often even harder, with labor. That meant working a certain number of days on the lord's fields, known as corvée, or forced labor. This give and take land and protection from the lord, in exchange for the peasant's work and part of the harvest, was the core of feudalism. Here's an important point that people often miss. The life of a medieval peasant wasn't just endless suffering and misery. Yes, it was hard, full of labor, and dependent on the weather and the will of the lord. But not all peasants were equally powerless. There were free peasants called villeins, who had more rights. They could leave their lord, sell their land, and their duties were clearly defined and limited. Serfs, on the other hand, lived under much stricter conditions. They were tied to the land and their lord. Their obligations were often heavier and less flexible. Wealth also varied a lot. Some peasants had a sturdy house, a cow, and a few sheep. Others barely survived. One year could bring hardship after a harsh winter or a bad harvest. Hunger was real, but there were also times of relative plenty, especially after a good harvest. Understanding this variety is key to seeing the real picture of medieval peasants, not just as a nameless, oppressed crowd, but as real people. They had families, worries, joys, and their social hierarchy. They were the ones who held up the entire world of the Middle Ages. Daily routine, work, food, and family life. Imagine the sound of a bell ringing at dawn, not a church bell, but the one calling people to work. The life of a medieval peasant followed the rhythm of the sun and the seasons. In summer, they got up long before sunrise. In winter, a bit later, but always with the first rooster's crow. How did their day begin? Not with a slow, peaceful breakfast. The first task was the animals. They had to milk the cow if they were lucky enough to have one, let out the sheep and chickens, and feed the pigs. Only after that could the family gather around the hearth for a simple meal, a piece of yesterday's bread, maybe some onion or turnip, and the main morning drink, ale. Don't be surprised, beer back then was much weaker and more nutritious than today. And everyone drank it, even children, because clean water was often hard to find. The heart of a peasant's day was hard, farm work. For most of the year, men, women, and even older children went out to the fields. In spring, they ploughed and planted rye, barley, oats, and peas. Summer meant weeding and cutting hay. Autumn was harvest time, the busiest season, when people worked from sunrise to sunset, afraid of rain or early frost. Every minute of daylight counted. Besides working on the Lord's land as part of their forced labor, peasants also had to tend their small plots. Their families' survival in winter depended on that harvest. Women, in addition to fieldwork, had a huge load of house duties: cooking, spinning wool or flax, weaving, taking care of the garden cabbage, beans, onions, garlic, watching the children, and collecting herbs and berries in the forest. Children began helping from a young age, often around 7 or 8. They would herd geese or sheep, gather firewood, watch their younger siblings, and help weed the garden beds. A peasant's food was simple, seasonal, and depended heavily on the harvest. The main part of their diet was bread, usually coarse, made from rye or barley. The most common dish was a thick stew or porridge called pottage that simmered over the fire all day, sometimes for several days in a row. It included whatever was available: crushed grains, beans, cabbage, turnips, onions, and sometimes bits of fat, or, if they were lucky, some salted meat. Meat, like pork, mutton, or, more rarely, beef wasn't eaten often, usually only on holidays, or after animals were slaughtered in autumn. Fish, especially freshwater fish, were more common. In summer and fall, their meals were enriched with garden vegetables, wild berries, mushrooms, and nuts from the forest. Sugar was a luxury, so sweet things meant honey if they kept bees or dried fruits. Dinner was usually even simpler than breakfast, and after eating, the family went to sleep soon after dark, saving firewood and candles. Work, food, sleep. That was the simple, labor-filled rhythm of daily life for medieval peasants. Homes and villages. How and where did they live? Imagine not a single farm far away, but a close-knit web of houses, roads, and fields, a medieval village. It wasn't just a group of huts. It was a living, breathing community, the center of the world for a peasant. Medieval peasant houses were very simple by today's standards. They were built from whatever nature nearby provided materials that were easy to find and free to use. The most common type of home was a one-story building with a frame made of oak or ash beams. The spaces between the beams were filled with woven twigs coated in a mixture of clay, manure and straw. This was called wattle and daub. The roof was steep, so snow and rain would slide off easily, and it was covered with straw or red. In forested areas, they might use wooden shingles. Windows were tiny and often had no glass because glass was expensive. Instead, they were covered with wooden shutters or stretched animal bladders treated with oil. Doors were low, not just to keep out the heat, but also to make anyone entering bow or even bump their head. Inside the house, there was just one big room. This was where the family lived, ate, slept, worked, and even kept newborn animals during winter for warmth and safety. The heart of the room was an open hearth in the center. Smoke rose under the roof and slowly filtered through the straw, which is why their clothes and hair always smelled smoky. There was little furniture, a rough table, benches along the walls, and a chest for valuables. People usually slept on benches or straw-stuffed mattresses right there in the same room. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with a layer of reeds. Was it cramped? Yes. Smoky? Very much so. But it was their warm, humble shelter. The village itself was carefully planned to help the community survive. Usually, a church stood in the center, not just a spiritual place, but a social hub too. Nearby was the village square or a green meadow where people held meetings, celebrations, and sometimes sold goods at a small market. There was always a communal bakery. Baking bread was a complex task, so not every house had its oven and often a blacksmith's workshop. Peasant houses stood fairly close together along unpaved streets or around the square. Right behind the houses were gardens where families grew vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees. Beyond the gardens stretched large fields, divided into narrow strips shared between families in the community. This was called the open field system. There were also common lands, meadows for grazing animals, pasture, forests where people collected firewood, berries, mushrooms, and grazed, pigs, and sometimes a pond or a stream. Community life was the foundation of everything. Peasants were connected not only by the lord's land, but also by a system of mutual responsibility within the village. They decided together when and what to plant, how to divide the strips of land in the fields, and when to start the harvest. They chose a village elder, usually one of the wealthier farmers, to represent them to the lord or his steward, helping neighbors in trouble. Working together for the village's benefit, like cleaning ditches or fixing bridges, and making sure everyone followed the village rules. All this created a strong web of dependence. Living alone back then was simply impossible. The village was their world, their protection, and their main community. Faith festivals and beliefs, if a peasant's work fed the body, then faith was food for the soul and their main guide in an unpredictable world. Religion in the Middle Ages touched almost every part of daily life. The church bell marked not only prayer times, but also the start of work, the lunch break, and the end of the workday. Sunday was sacred, officially. No work was allowed, except the most urgent tasks, like feeding the animals. The whole village gathered for Mass. This wasn't just a religious service. It was the most important social event of the week. People shared news, made plans, showed off new clothes, even if simple, and young people looked for potential partners. The priest, often coming from a peasant background himself, and not always highly educated, was a key figure. He baptized, married, held funerals, gave advice, sometimes even medical, and acted as a go-between for the village and the Lord. But the church calendar gave more than just duties. It also brought much-needed breaks, filled with festivals and celebrations. The year was divided into cycles marked by medieval holidays, many of which had deep pre-Christian roots, but were renamed for saints. The winter holidays from Christmas to Epiphany were a time of caroling, dressing up in costumes, plenty of food as much as the stores allowed, games, and fortune-telling. Maslenitsa, before Lent, was about pancakes, fun, and burning an effigy of winter. Easter was the most important Christian holiday, marking rebirth with food blessings, games like rolling eggs, and hope for a good harvest. May Day welcomed spring, with homes decorated with greenery, the crowning of the May Queen, and circle dances. The summer solstice included bonfires, jumping over fire, searching for the mythical fernflower, bathing, and gathering healing herbs. Finally, the harvest festival, held on different days at the end of summer or fall, was a time to give thanks for the bread, enjoy pies made from the new grain, and take part in fairs. Why were these holidays so important? They were more than just entertainment. They gave structure to the year, offering breaks from exhausting work, bringing the community together, and letting people release stress. These moments of joy and unity, even if brief, meant a lot to everyone. Beneath the surface of official Christianity, a strong layer of folk beliefs and superstitions bubbled among peasants. The medieval peasants' world was filled not only with saints, but also with spirits. House guardians, forest spirits, water beings, mermaids, witches, and evil forces. Peasant beliefs came with many rules and taboos. Don't whistle inside the house, or money will leave. Spilling salt meant a quarrel. Knocking on wood protected against the evil eye. Spells and charms were used to protect from illness, bad luck, sick animals, and failed harvests. Healers and fortune-tellers, often older women, were respected for their skills in stopping bleeding, using herbs, or warding off storms. People feared the evil eye and believed in signs, like the owl's cry predicting trouble or the cuckoo's call telling how many years one would live. They especially honored blessed places, springs, stones, and old trees. This mix of Christianity and pagan beliefs wasn't a contradiction but a curious blend that helped explain the unexplainable, protect from evil, and find some support in a dangerous world. Faith, both church and folk, was a real, everyday part of their lives, just as real as the weight of a hoe in their hands or the smell of fresh baked bread. Hardships and rights. What challenges did they face? The life of a medieval peasant, even in relatively peaceful times, was a constant balancing act. Hardships and duties weighed heavily on their shoulders, often unfairly. The main source of pressure was the feudal system itself and its demands. Labor duties, corvée. The most hated obligation for many peasants was corvée, the required number of days, often 2 to 3, or even more per week, that they had to work for free on the Lord's land. Ploughing, planting, harvesting, cutting hay, fixing roads, or strengthening the castle walls. All this took time away from their fields during the busiest season. The Lord's steward closely watched the quality and the amount of this work. Payments in goods and money. Even after working their corvée, peasants were not free. They paid a tithe to the church, usually 1/10 of their crops or livestock, a required payment that was not always fair. To the Lord, they paid a tallage, a money tax that could be raised at will. and a ching, a fixed fee for using the land. On top of that, there were many small charges, for grinding grain at the Lord's mill, often a monopoly, for baking bread in the communal oven, for crossing the Lord's bridge, and for grazing pigs in the Lord's forest. Got a daughter's wedding, pay a ransom to the Lord. Father died, pay an inheritance tax. Personal unfreedom of serfs. For serfs, the burden was even heavier. They couldn't leave their lord without permission, couldn't marry freely, they needed the lord's consent, and often had to pay a fee, and couldn't even sell their only cow without his approval. They were considered part of the lord's property, tied to the land, vulnerability to the forces of nature and society. The peasant was defenseless in the face of crises, poor harvests and famine. 2 or 3 bad harvests in a row could plunge the whole village into hunger. Food stores ran out, and bread prices soared. People ate roots, tree bark, and carrion. Death rates rose sharply, especially among children and the elderly. Diseases, poor sanitation, overcrowding, and malnutrition made peasants easy victims for epidemics. The plague, the Black Death, in the 14th century wiped out up to 1/3 of Europe's population. Smallpox, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed entire families. Medicine was primitive and hard to access. War, an army passing through, even if it was their own, was a disaster. Soldiers took food and livestock by force, burned homes and crops, robbed, raped, and killed. War turned peasants into helpless victims. Was there hope, rights, and resistance? Despite everything, peasants were not completely powerless slaves. Free peasants' villains had clearly defined rights and duties written down in village charters. They could go to court, although justice for peasants was rare. Even serfs had the right to their land and the lord's protection from outside threats. Even if mostly symbolic, the main support was the community, which could negotiate together with the lord or his steward to defend their interests. And when the pressure became unbearable, revolts broke out. The most famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by Wat Tyler. Peasants, angry about a new poll tax and growing efforts to tie them to the land, marched on London, demanding the end of serfdom and lower taxes. Although the revolt was brutally crushed and its leaders executed, it showed that peasant patience had limits, and it made many lords think twice. The life of a medieval peasant is not just a story of hard labor and hardship, it's also a story of endurance, deep connection to the land, community, strength, and rare but bold attempts to seek justice in an unjust world. Toyotomi Hideyos, Toyotomi Hideyos, Toyotomi Hideyos. Japanese pronunciation 2.jo.2 Joe C. The 27th of March 1537 to 18 September 1598, otherwise known as Kinoshita Tokichiro, Musa Tungjilang, and Hashiba Hideyoshi Uchei Soji Ichai Seoji, was a Japanese samurai and daimyo, feudal lord of the late Sengoku and Azuchi Momoyama periods, and regarded as the second great unifier of Japan. Although he came from a peasant background, his immense power earned him the rank and title of Kanpaku, Imperial Regent, and Dayu Dajin, Taichen Dachin, Chancellor of the realm, the highest official position and title in the nobility class. He was the first person in history to become a Kanpaku who was not born a noble. He then passed the position and title of Kanpaku to his nephew, Toyotomi. He remained in power as Taika, the title of retired Kanpaku, until his death. It is believed but not certain, that the reason he refused or could not obtain the title of shogun, Jungi-Jongjin, the leader of the warrior class, was because he was of peasant origin. Hideyoshi rose from a peasant background as a retainer of the prominent Lord Oda Nobunaga to become one of the most powerful men in Japanese history. He distinguished himself in many of Nobunaga's campaigns. After Nobunaga's death in the Honnoji incident in Iten Wubai Basha, Hideyoshi defeated his assassin Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki and became Nobunaga's successor. He then continued the campaign to unite Japan that led to the closing of the Sengoku period. Hideyoshi became the de facto leader of Japan and acquired the prestigious positions of Daiyujin and Kampoku by the mid-1580s. He conquered Shikoku in 1585 and Kishu in 1587, and completed the unification by winning the siege of Odawara in 1590 and crushing the Kunohei Rebellion in 1591. With the unification of Japan complete, Hideyoshi launched the Japanese invasions of Korea in 1592 to initial success, but eventual military stalemate damaged his prestige before his death in 1598. Hideyoshi's young son and successor, Toyotomi Hidori, was displaced by Tokugawa Ieyasu at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, which would lead to the founding of the Tokugawa shogunate. Hideyoshi's rule covers most of the Azuchi Momoyama period of Japan, partially named after his castle, Momoyama Castle. Hideyoshi left an influential and lasting legacy in Japan, including Osaka Castle, the Tokugawa class system, the restriction on the possession of weapons to the samurai, and the construction and restoration of many temples, some of which are still visible in Kyoto. Early life, 1537 to 1558. Very little is known for certain about Toyotomi Hideyoshi before 1570, when he begins to appear in surviving documents and letters. His autobiography starts in 1577, but in it, Hideyoshi spoke very little about his past. According to tradition, Hideyoshi was born on February 16, 1537. According to the lunar Japanese calendar, March 17, 1537. According to the Julian calendar, March 27, 1537. Proleptic Gregorian calendar in Nakamura, Owari Province, present-day Nakamura Ward, Nagoya, in the middle of the chaotic Sengoku period under the collapsed Ashikaga shogunate. Hideyoshi had no traceable samurai lineage, and his father, Kinoshita Yeman, was an ashigaru, a peasant employed by the samurai as a foot soldier. Hideyoshi had no surname, and his childhood given name was Hayoshimaru Rujiwa, Japanese pronunciation Ki.Jo, C, Ma, D, although variations exist. Yeman died in 1543 when Hideyoshi was 7 years old. Many legends describe Hideyoshi being sent to study at a temple as a young man, but he rejected temple life and went in search of adventure. Under the name Kinoshita Tokichiro, Morsad Tung Jilam, he first joined the Imagawa clan as a servant to a local ruler named Matsushita Jukitsuna Songsa Jugang, serviced under Nobunaga 1558 sampai 1582. In 1558, Hideyoshi became an ashigaru for the powerful Oda clan, the rulers of his home province of Owari, now headed by the ambitious Oda Nobunaga. Hideyoshi soon became Nobunaga's sandal-bearer, a position of relatively high status. According to his biographers, Hideyoshi also supervised the repair of Kiyosu Castle, a claim described as apocryphal, and managed the kitchen. After Nobunaga noticed his talents at the Battle of Okayazama in 1560, when Nobunaga defeated Imagawa Yoshimoto, he became one of Nobunaga's trusted retainers, In 1561, Hideyoshi married one, the adopted daughter of Asano Nagakatsu, a descendant of Minamoto no Yorimitsu. Hideyoshi carried out repairs on Tsunemata Castle with his younger half-brother Hashiba Koichiro, along with Hachizuka Masakatsu and Menno Nagayasu. Hideyoshi's efforts were well received because Tsunemata was in enemy territory, and according to legend, Hideyoshi constructed a fort in Tsunemata overnight and discovered a secret route into Mount Inaba, after which much of the local garrison surrendered. Citation needed 100 aspects of the moon, no. 6. By Yoshitoshi, Mount Inaba Moon, 1885, 12th month. The young Toyotomi Hideyoshi, then named Kinoshita Tokichiro, leads a small group assaulting the castle on Mount Inaba. In 1564, Hideyoshi found success as a negotiator. He managed to convince a number of Mino warlords to desert the Satu clan, mostly with liberal bribes. This included the Satu clan's strategist, Takanaka Sheikaru. Citation needed Nobunaga's easy victory at the siege of Inabayama Castle in 1567 was largely due to Hideyoshi's efforts. And despite his peasant origins, in 1568, Hideyoshi became one of Nobunaga's most distinguished generals, eventually taking the name Hashiba Hideyoshi, Uchai-soji. The new surname included 2 characters, one each from Oda's right hand, Men wa Nagahaido, Niwa Nagahide, and Shibata Katsuye, and the new given name included characters from Akechi Mitsuhide, Minji Guangso, and Mori Yoshinari, Sen Jichen. In Iten Wubai Tishe, Hideyoshi protected Nobunaga's retreat from Ozuya Sekura forces at Konagasaki. Later, in June 1570, Nobunaga allied with Tokugawa Ieyasu at the Battle of Anigawa to lay siege to 2 fortresses of the Ozai and Asokura clans, and Hideyoshi was assigned to lead Oda troops into open battle for the first time in 1573. After victorious campaigns against the Ozai and Asokura, Nobunaga appointed Hideyoshi daimyo of 3 districts in the northern part of Jemi province. Initially, Hideyoshi stayed at the former Ozai headquarters at Odoni Castle, but moved to Kunitomo town and renamed it Nagahama in tribute to Nobunaga. Hideyoshi later moved to the port at Imahama on Lake Biwa, where he began work on Imahama Castle and took control of the nearby Kunitomo firearms factory that had been established some years previously by the Ozai and Asokura. Under Hideyoshi's administration, the factory's output of firearms increased dramatically. Later, Hideyoshi participated in the 1573 siege of Nagoshi, Maine. 1574. Hideyoshi and Araki Murashige captured Itami Castle, and later in 1575 he fought in the Battle of Nagashino against the Takeda clan. In 1576, he took part in the siege of Mitsuji, part of the 11-year Ishiyama Honginji War. Later, Nobunaga sent Hideyoshi to Himeji Castle to conquer the Chigoku region from the Mori clan. Hideyoshi then fought in the Battle of Tedarugawa, 1577, the Siege of Miki, 1578, the Siege of Tottori, 1581, and the Siege of Takamatsu, 1582. Death of Nobunaga, June 21st, 1582. During the Siege of Takamatsu, Oda Nobunaga and his eldest son and heir Nobutada were both killed in the Honnoji incident. Their assassination ended Nobunaga's quest to consolidate centralized power in Japan under his authority. Hideyoshi, seeking vengeance for the death of his lord, made peace with the Mori clan, and 13 days later met Akechi Mitsuhide and defeated him at the Battle of Yamazaki, avenging Nobunaga and taking his authority and power for himself. 275, 279, 279. Meanwhile, the HJ clan and the Uesugi clan invaded Kai and Shinano province when they heard of Nobunaga's death, beginning the Tenshu Jingo War. When the Oda clan learned of the defeat of Takigawa Kazumasu at the Battle of Kanagawa by the HJ clan, Hideyoshi sent a letter to Ieyasu on July 7th giving him authorization to lead military operations to secure the two provinces from the HJ and Uesugi clans. As the war turned in Ieyasu's favor and Sanada Masayuki defected to the Tokugawa side, the HJ clan negotiated a truce. HJ Yujinobu and 2 Naomasa were the HJ and Tokugawa representatives for the preliminary meetings. Representatives from the Oda clan, such as Oda Nobukatsu, Oda Nobu, and Hideyoshi himself mediated the negotiation until the truce officially took effect in October, with both Ieyasu and HJ Yujino exchanging family members as hostages as a sign of goodwill. Rise to power 1582 to 1585. In 1582, Hideyoshi began construction of Osaka Castle, built on the site of the temple Ishiyama Hongenji, which was destroyed by Nobunaga. Construction was completed in 1597. The castle would become the last stronghold of the Toyotomi clan after Hideyoshi's death conflict with Katsuin, late 1582. Hideyoshi was in a very strong position. He summoned the powerful daimyo to Kiyosu Castle so that they could determine Nobunaga's heir. Oda Nobukatsu and Oda Nobutaka quarreled, causing Hideyoshi to instead choose Nobunaga's infant grandson, Oda Hidenobu. Having won the support of the other two Oda clan elders, Niwa Nagahide and Ikeda Tsuneyoki, Hideyoshi was able to distribute Nobunaga's provinces among the generals and form a council of 4 generals to help Hidenobu govern. Shibata Katsui initially supported Hideyoshi's decision, but later supported Nobunaga's third son, Nobutaka, for whom Katsui had performed the Genpyuku ritual. He allied with Nobutaka and Takigawa Kazamasu against Hideyoshi. Tension quickly escalated between Hideyoshi and Katsui, and at the Battle of Shizugatok in the following year, Hideyoshi destroyed Katsui's forces. Hideyoshi had thus consolidated his own power, dealt with most of the Oda clan, and now controlled some 30 provinces. Conflict with Ieyasu in 1584. Nobukatsu allied himself with Tokugawa Ieyasu, and the two sides fought at the inconclusive Battle of Kamaki and Nagakute. This ultimately resulted in a stalemate. Although Hideyoshi's forces were delivered a heavy blow, Ieyasu and Hideyoshi never fought against each other in person, but the former managed to check the advance of the latter's allies. After Hideyoshi and Ieyasu heard the news of Ikeda Tsuneyoki and Mori Nagayoshi's deaths, both withdrew their troops. Later, Hideyoshi made peace with Nobukatsu and Ieyasu, ending the pretext for war between the Tokugawa and Hashiba clans. However, Ieyasu continued to refuse to become Hideyoshi's vassal. Hideyoshi began to move towards attacking Ieyasu, but just then the Tenshu earthquake occurred. Osaka suffered extensive damage, causing Hideyoshi to abandon the campaign against Ieyasu. Hideyoshi sent his younger sister Asahi no Kata and mother Mamando Koro to Tokugawa Ieyasu as hostages. In response, Ieyasu finally traveled to Osaka and expressed his intention to submit to Hideyoshi Toen clan and imperial court appointment, like Oda Nobunaga before him. Hideyoshi never achieved the title of Instead, he arranged to have himself adopted by Kano Sakihisa, one of the noblest men belonging to the Fujiwara clan, and secured a succession of high court titles. These included Chancellor Daodajin and In-Iwu Bawu, the prestigious position of Imperial Regent Kampuku. Also in 1585, Hideyoshi was formally given the new clan name Toyotomi instead of Fujiwara by the imperial court. He built a lavish palace in 1587, the Urukudai, and entertained the reigning emperor Go-Yozei. The following year, unification of Japan. 1585 to 1592, Nagoroji campaign. Also, in 1585, Hideyoshi launched the siege of Nagoroji and subjugated Ki province. The Nagorogumi, the warrior monks of Nagoroji, were allied with the Ikki, and with Tokugawa Ieyasu, whom they supported in the Battle of Komaki and Nagakute the previous year. After attacking a number of other outposts in the area, Hideyoshi's forces attacked Nagoroji from two sides. Many of the Nagorogumi had already fled to Tita Castle by this time, which Hideyoshi later besieged. The complex was set aflame, beginning with the residences of the priests, and Hideyoshi's samurai cut down monks as they escaped the blazing buildings. Shikoku campaign. In the 1585 invasion of Toyotomi forces seized Shikaku Island, the smallest of Japan's four main islands. From Chosokabe to Chika, Toyotomi's forces arrived 113,000 strong under Toyotomi Hidetsugu Yukita Hidai and the Mori clans. Two rivers, Kobayaka Takakage and Kikawa. Opposing them were 40,000 men of Chosokabe's. Despite the overwhelming size of Hideyoshi's army and the suggestions of his advisors, Motochika chose to fight to defend his territories. The battles culminated in the siege of Ichinomiya Castle, which lasted for 26 days. Chosokabe made a half-hearted attempt to relieve his castle from the siege, but eventually surrendered. He was allowed to keep Tosa province, while the rest of Shikoku was divided among Hideyoshi's generals. Toyama campaigned during the late summer of August 1585. Hideyoshi launched an attack on each province and Hideo province. He dispatched Kanamori Nagachika to destroy the Anaga-Koji clan of Hida, while Hideyoshi carried out the siege of Toyama Castle. The Toyama Castle garrison of 20,000, led by Hideyoshi's former ally Sasa Narimasa, tried to defend against Hideyoshi's 100,000 soldiers. In the end, Narimasa's defense was shattered, opening the way for Toyotomi's supremacy over Echi province and Hida province. Kyushu campaign. In 1586, Hideyoshi conquered Kishi, wresting control from the Shimazu clan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's half-brother landed to the south of Bungo province on Kyushu's eastern coast. Meanwhile, Hideyoshi took his own forces down a more western route in Chikazan province. Later that year, with a total of 200,000 soldiers against the 30,000 men of the Shimazu forces, the two brothers met in Satsuma province. They besieged Kagoshima Castle, the Shimazu clan's home. The Shimazu surrendered, and Hideyoshi was able to return his attention to the HJ clan of Kanto, the last major clan to oppose him. Later, in 1587, Hideyoshi banished Christian missionaries from Kisha, either to exert greater control over the Kiroshitan daimyo, or to prohibit human trafficking. Around that time, at least 50,000 Japanese people were sold overseas as slaves, mainly by Portuguese merchants. However, since he did much trade with Europeans, individual Christians were unofficially overlooked. In 1588, Hideyoshi forbade ordinary peasants from owning weapons and started a sword hunt to confiscate all weapons owned by peasants. The weapons were melted down into building material for the Hall of the Great Buddha at the Heike-ji Temple in Kyoto, that was built by Hideyoshi. This measure effectively stopped peasant revolts and ensured greater stability at the expense of freedom of the individual daimyo. Odawara campaign. In Iten Wubai Joshu, Hideyoshi carried out the Odawara campaign against the HJ clan in the Kanto region. This was the first battle that involved the alliance between Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Hideyoshi's army of 220,000 men surrounded Odawara Castle and its 82,000-strong HJ garrison in what has been called the most unconventional siege lines in samurai history. The samurai were entertained by everything from concubines, prostitutes, and musicians to acrobats, fire eaters, and jugglers. The defenders slept on the ramparts with their arquebuses and armor. Despite their smaller numbers, they discouraged Hideyoshi from attacking. Hideyoshi had Ishigakiyama Ichiya Castle secretly constructed in a nearby forest, and then had the forest chopped down, giving the impression it had been built overnight. This demoralized the defenders, leading to their surrender 3 months after the start of the siege. During the siege, Hideyoshi offered Ieyasu the 8 HJ-ruled provinces in the Kanto region in exchange for the submission of Ieyasu's 5 provinces, which Ieyasu accepted. Death of Sen no Rikuin, February 1591. Hideyoshi ordered Sen no Rikuin to commit suicide. Likely in one of his angry outbursts, Rikuin had been a trusted retainer and master of the tea ceremony under both Hideyoshi and Nobunaga. Under Hideyoshi's patronage, Rikyu made significant changes to the aesthetics of the tea ceremony that had a lasting influence over many aspects of Japanese culture. Even after Rikyu's death, Hideyoshi is said to have built his many construction projects based upon aesthetics promoted by Rikya citation. Following Rikyu's death, Hideyoshi turned his attention from tea ceremony to No, which he had been studying since becoming imperial regent. During his brief stay in Nagoya Castle in what is today's Saga Prefecture, Onkisha Hideyoshi memorized the shite lead role parts of 10 No plays, which he then performed, forcing various daimyo to accompany him on stage as the waki secondary accompanying role. He even performed before the Emperor Konohei Rebellion, the Kunohei Rebellion, an insurrection that occurred in Mutsu Province from March 13th to September 4th, 1591, began when Kunohei Masazane, a claimant to daimyo of the Nanbu clan, launched a rebellion against his rival, Nonbu Nobunao, which spread across Mutsu Province. Nobunao was backed by Hideyoshi, who, along with, sent a large army into the Tohoku region in mid-1591, which quickly defeated the rebels. Hideyoshi's army arrived at Kunohei Castle in early September. Masazane, outnumbered, surrendered Kunohei Castle and was executed with the castle defenders. The Konohei Rebellion was the final battle in Hideyoshi's campaigns during the Sengoku period and completed the unification of Japan Teiku. 1592 to 1598, the future stability of the Toyotomi dynasty after Hideyoshi's eventual death was put in doubt when his only son, 3-year-old Tsurumatsu, died in September 1591, which followed his half-brother Hidenaga's death from illness earlier that year in February. Hideyoshi subsequently named his nephew Hidetsugu his heir, adopting him in January 1592. Hideyoshi resigned as Kampaku to take the title of Teiku, retired regent, and Hidetsugu succeeded him as Kampaku. Hideyoshi adopted Oda Nobunaga's dream of a Japanese conquest of China and launched the conquest of the Ming dynasty by way of Korea, at the time known as Koryu or Joseon. In 1592, Hideyoshi began an invasion of Korea with the intent of conquering Korea and eventually Ming China. 99 Hideyoshi's explicit war goal was for Japan to replace China at the top of the international order. 92 Hideyoshi wrote to his adopted son Hidetsugu that it is not Ming China alone that is destined to be subjugated by us, but India, the Philippines, and many islands in the South Sea will share a like fate. Succession dispute following Hideyoshi's appointment of his nephew Hidetsugu to the position of Kampaku. Tensions started to develop due to the dual power structure between Hidetsugu, who led the court system, and Hideyoshi, who retained actual military power as retired regent. Although Hideyoshi orchestrated Hidetsugu's rise, the regent's position was governed by established court frameworks, limiting Hideyoshi's ability to bypass precedents. This led to the formation of two factions, the Teiko Hideyoshi's group and the Kampaku Hidetsugu's group, which clashed over political and military issues. The birth of Hideyoshi's second son in 1593, Hideyori, exacerbated these tensions, as it introduced another potential heir to the Toyotomi dynasty. In July 1595, amidst suspicions of treason and the ongoing Korean invasion, Hidetsugu was stripped of his titles, exiled to Mount Kia, and then ordered to commit suicide in August 1595. Hidetsugu's family, members who did not follow his example, including 31 women and several children, were then beheaded in Kyoto. In the aftermath, Hideyoshi solidified his authority by securing loyalty oaths, signed in blood, from magistrates and daimyos, including influential daimyo like Tokugawa Ieyasu, Maeda Toshi, Yukita Hidei, Mori Teramoto, and Kobayaka TAKAKAGE.20-6 Martyrs of Japan in January 1597. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had 26 Christians arrested as an example to Japanese who wanted to convert to Christianity. They are known as the 26 Martyrs of Japan. They included 5 European Franciscan missionaries, 1 Mexican Franciscan missionary, 3 Japanese Jesuits, and 17 Japanese laymen, including 3 young boys. They were tortured, mutilated, and paraded through towns across Japan. On February 5th, they were executed in Nagasaki by public crucifixion. Second campaign against Korea after several years of negotiations, broken off because envoys of both sides falsely reported that the opposition had surrendered. Hideyoshi appointed Kobayaka Hideaki to lead a renewed invasion of Korea. This invasion met with less success than the first. Japanese troops remained pinned down in Gyeongsang province, and although the Japanese forces turned back several Chinese offensives in Sunjin and Sachin in June 1598, they were unable to make further progress as the Ming army prepared for a final assault. While Hideyoshi's battle at Sachin, led by Shimazu Yoshihiro, was a major Japanese victory, all 3 parties to the war were exhausted. He told his commander in Korea, "Don't let my soldiers become spirits in a foreign land." Death died at Fushimi Castle on September 18, 1598, Kaiko-sen, 18th day of the 8th month. His last words, delivered to his closest daimyo and generals, were, "I depend upon you for everything. I have no other thoughts to leave behind. It is sad to part from you." His death was kept secret by the Council of 5 Elders to preserve morale, and they ordered Japanese forces in Korea to return to Japan. According to the Tokugawa Jiki record, Hideyoshi held a secret meeting with Koide Hidemasa and Katajiri Katsumoto, where he shared his regret of launching invasions of Korea. Hideyoshi also instructed Hidemasa and Katsumoto to guide Hideyori into making an alliance with Ieyasu, as he predicted the power of the Tokugawa clan would grow unchecked after his death, and the only solution for the Toyotomi clan to survive was to not oppose Ieyasu after Hideyoshi's death. The other members of the Council of 5 Elders were unable to keep Ieyasu's ambitions in check. 2 of Hideyoshi's top generals, Kato Kiyomasa and Fukushima Masanori, had fought bravely during the war, but returned to find the Toyotomi clan Castellan Ishida Mitsunari in power. He held the generals in contempt, and they sided with Ieyasu. Hidori lost the power his father once held. and Ieyasu's power was consolidated when his eastern army defeated the Mitsunaris western army at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Ieyasu, who was appointed as a shogun in 1603 and established the Tokugawa shogunate, attacked Osaka Castle twice, in 1614 and 1615, the siege of Osaka, forcing Hideyoshi's concubine Yododano and Hidori to commit suicide, destroying the Toyotomi clan resilience, revolt, and shifting sands despite oppression. Village communities found strength through rituals, mutual aid, or clandestine shifts. In Europe, the Black Death's aftermath led some serfs to demand wages and freedom. In Japan, feudal upheavals and reforms began to shift the rigid old order. Hardship, ultimately, sparked change. Life of peasantry serfs in the Middle Ages, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The barbarian kings and military leaders seized the former Roman estates together with their working force, slaves and coloni, while the remained area was eventually settled by other members of the invading peoples as free peasants. Slaves, coloni tenant farmers who worked on latifondias' large Roman estates, and members of free rural communities slowly disappeared over the following centuries and began to form the class of peasantry or serfs. The lowest class of the feudal society. Instability, which marked the period of the early Middle Ages, forced the small landowners and free peasants to seek protection at the nearest powerful landlord, which eventually led to the loss of their ownership of land, but not the right of its use, and often also to loss of their personal freedom. However, medieval peasants were not a homogeneous group and were subdivided into the following groups. Free tenants or free peasants were rent-paying tenant farmers owing little or no service to the lord, but they very few in number. Villeins were the most common type of serfs in the medieval times. They lived on landlords' fief and spend part of their time working on their lord's fields in return for protection and the right to work on their leased fields. In addition, they were also obliged to provide some other services as well as to cede their lord part of their harvest. Villeins were tied to the land and could not move away nor get married without their lord's consent. Cotters were of lower rank than the villeins, did not possess leaseholds, and worked for more prosperous villeins or for the feudal lords in exchange for food. Wage earners worked on all feudal estates and received a payment in exchange for their labor. Slaves were very few in number, usually of foreign birth, and worked for the feudal lord exclusively for survival. Medieval peasants lived in villages or manors, agricultural units held by secular or ecclesiastical lords. Peasants who lived on the land of the secular lords were also obliged to offer a tenth of their harvest and other products to the church. Besides cultivating the land, the medieval peasants also had to make and repair tools, dishes, clothes, coaches, horse gear, and other items for their own as well as for their lord's needs. However, there was also a considerable number of communities which were engaged in non-agricultural activities such as mining, forestry, transportation, and crafts. While some coast villages were primarily engaged in fishing, the land cultivated by peasants was divided on domain or lord's fief, an agricultural unit retained by the feudal lords for their own use and depended serf or villein holdings. Agricultural units nominally held by the feudal lords, while the real property was held by the peasants as tenants, obliged to provide labor services and to cede part of their products to the feudal lord tenancy. Of the dependent serf holdings was generally granted for the duration of its tenant's life and could not be inherited, while the descendants of a deceased tenant had to renew the right to the leasehold. and to pay a tax to the landlord, which was usually in a form of a donation of one cow or some other animal. Besides the fields, domain encompassed meadows, forests and swamps, which were used by the landlord as well as by the serfs, who were forbidden to hunt, and had to pay a redemption for pasturing the stock on common meadows and for cutting the firewood in the forests. Polyptychs and later herbariums provide the best insight into obligations and rights of the medieval serfs, and also reveal great differences between different subgroups of serfs, as well as between different regions and geographical conditions. Feudal obligations of the serfs, who were descendants of the slaves or colony, were incomparably greater than of the free tenants, who paid a rent and owed very little or no service to the landlord, while the peasants in lowlands had much greater obligations than the peasants in the hills. In some mountain areas there were no feudal obligations at all. The manor was not only an agricultural unit, but it was also an administrative, political and jurisdictional unit. The borders of the feudal landholding were generally also the borders of political authority of its owner, who had its own army and patrimonial court. Thus, the landlord was exercising both administrative and judicial authority over his serfs, who were also obliged to pay the court fees and the tax for the administration. An average medieval peasant had very little time left when finishing work. Peasant's home was a simple wooden thatched hut, which initially consisted of one room and also served as shelter for livestock and poultry. The hut's room was later rebuilt with a fireplace into a separate room for the family and a stable for the livestock. An average peasant family in the medieval times consisted of 10 members, while married couples left their families and went on their own leasehold if they received it. Very young women usually married already at age of 14 years and gave birth to the first child at age of 15. Nativity was in average from 4 to 8 children, but the mortality of the children was very high, 15 to 20% during the first year and 30% by the age of 20 years. The mortality was higher in the male population during the period of childhood, while high percentage of mortality at childbirth resulted in the higher mortality of the female population after 14 years of age. Clothes of medieval peasants were self-made, usually of linen, hemp, wool and fur. Food of peasants predominantly consisted of cereals in a form of porridge or gruel and seasonal vegetables, while bread was rare. The principal meat was pork. Fruit growing was poorly developed, with exception of viticulture, which was encouraged by the church for its need of wine. Stable animal husbandry did exist, while livestock pastured on common meadows during the winter. The majority of livestock and poultry was slaughtered. The mentality and culture of medieval peasantry was greatly influenced by the church, which was also the center of the social life of peasantry. The medieval peasant population was illiterate but developed rich folklore culture which survived until nowadays. During long winter evenings, at yarning and other activities, people told each other various stories and adventures, while the friars and wayfaring artisans and craftsmen provided news from the other lands and countries. Life of an average medieval peasant was simple, hard and often greatly affected by poverty, numerous diseases and occasional famines. However, colonization of new lands, progress of agricultural techniques and tools, and economic progress had great impact on the life of the medieval peasantry. Technical progress in agriculture made the work on the fields a lot easier and provided better yields, while colonization of new lands by deforestation, drying out marshes, settlement of the hills and depopulated provided additional agricultural land and led to emergence of new villages. Peasants in colonized areas obtained approximately equal shares of land and more favorable status. The crisis of the late Middle Ages, marked by economic crisis and series of famines and plagues, in first place by the Great Famine of 1315–17 and the Black Death in the 1340s, greatly affected all classes of feudal society, including the peasants, reduced rural population, increased need for wage workers, and series of peasants. Revolts eventually led to weakening of serfdom, which virtually disappeared in Western Europe by the end of the late Middle Ages. However, serfdom and bondage to the land persisted in Central and Eastern Europe until the middle of the 19th century.